Her scream wasn't loud, just sharp enough to cut through the morning frost. Ethan Walker stopped mid-stride, his rifle half raised, breath clouding in the bitter cold. There, tangled in the steel jaws of his snare, lay a young Apache woman. Blood streaked her ankle where the trap had torn skin. Her dark eyes burned with panic, not pain, as if she expected him to finish what the world had already done to her. For a long moment, neither moved. The snow fell in fine dust between them, the forest holding its breath. She clutched a rock in her hand, small, dull, no weapon at all, but her grip was fierce, trembling with defiance. Ethan lowered the rifle slowly. He knew that kind of fear. He had seen it on battlefields, in the eyes of boys too young to die. He crouched, the old wound in his knee tightening like a knot. The snare was meant for rabbits, not people. The steel teeth had cut deep into her ankle, and the blood had soaked into the frost around her foot. She flinched when he drew his knife, a strangled cry caught in her throat. But Ethan turned the blade, not toward her, but toward the trap, sawing through the rope with a practiced hand. The steel sprang loose, and her body slackened in the dirt. She tried to push herself away, but exhaustion pulled her down again. He could have walked off then, left her to the wolves, to the snow, to whatever curse her people believed she carried. She wasn't his problem. But Ethan had buried too many bodies in too many ditches. He looked at her ankle, swollen, bleeding, already turning blue at the edges, and he knew she wouldn't last a night. The air hung still, the kind of stillness that felt almost holy. His hand tightened on the knife, then he slid it back into its sheath. He bent, lifting her gently into his arms. She struck at him weakly, fists pushing against his chest, but her strength was gone. Her body trembled with cold and fever. Against his coat, her skin felt fragile, warm in places, ice in others. Each step toward the cabin sent a lance of pain up his ruined leg, but he kept on, carrying her across the ridge. She gripped his collar once, out of desperation or trust, he couldn't tell. By the time he shouldered the cabin door open, the fire inside had gone low. He laid her on the cot near the stove, pulled a blanket over her torn deerskin dress, and turned away to stoke the embers back to life. Her eyes never left him, wide, unblinking, still wary. Ethan said nothing, only stirred the fire until it caught, orange glow painting the log walls. In the silence, an old verse stirred in his mind, words his mother used to whisper when fear pressed hard against the night. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The fire caught slowly, licking up the sides of the blackened logs, sending warmth across the single-room cabin. Ethan poured water into a dented tin pot and set it by the flames. Behind him, he could feel her eyes watching every move, sharp as a hawk cornered by the snare. He crouched beside her, keeping his hands low, voice flat. "This will sting." She didn't answer. Her lips were cracked, breath shallow, chest rising quick beneath the torn hide. When he pressed the cloth to her ankle, she gasped and grabbed the cot post, knuckles white. Ethan worked steady, cleaning blood and frost from the wound. He'd seen worse on the field, in camps, but it felt different here, with her staring at him like she didn't know whether he'd save her or finish her. When the bandage was tied, he rose, poured a ladle of stew from the pot hanging near the stove, and set it on the stool beside her. She didn't touch it. Her gaze shifted from the bowl to his face, searching for a trick, a trap. "Eat," he said simply. For a long while she didn't move. Then, with small, cautious motions, she pulled the bowl to her chest and sipped. Each swallow looked painful, like her throat had forgotten how to take food. She didn't look at him while she ate, only the fire. Ethan sank into his chair across the room, rifle leaning against the wall. His body ached with the familiar throb of his knee, but his mind circled only one thought. What in God's name had brought her here, half dead, bleeding into his snare? She finished the stew, set the bowl aside, and lay back. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on him. The blanket slipped, revealing the torn line of her dress at the shoulder. Ethan turned his face toward the flames, refusing the look. Respect was a language few men spoke to her, he guessed. The hours dragged. Wind clawed at the shutters, rattling the seams of the cabin. She shifted on the cot, breath uneven, sleep refusing to come. Ethan lay on the floor with his wool blanket pulled tight, one boot still on, the way he'd done since the war. He never slept deep. He heard her turn, sit up, lie back again, whisper something soft in Apache to the fire. When dawn came pale through the shutters, she was awake, eyes red from the night. Ethan rose stiffly, stirred the fire back to life, and cracked an egg over the skillet. He glanced toward her once, then asked quietly, "You understand English?" Her gaze held him, uncertain, then gave the smallest nod. So it wasn't ignorance, it was choice. She hadn't spoken because she hadn't trusted. Ethan didn't press. He slid jerky into the grease, the smell rising warm in the small room. For the first time, her eyes flicked toward the pan not with suspicion, but hunger. He divided the food onto 2 plates, set one on the stool near her cot, and stepped back without a word. This time she reached for it faster. Not desperate, but steady. She ate everything. And when she finished, she did not look away from him. It wasn't thanks, it wasn't surrender. It was the first sign she might stay. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The fire hissed as snowmelt dripped from Ethan's boots, pooling dark on the plank floor. He crouched again beside the cot, cloth and basin ready. The Apache woman's eyes followed his hands, as though every twitch of his fingers might turn against her. He spoke low, steady, the way he'd talked to wounded soldiers years before. "I need to clean it again. Hold still." Her lips parted, but no sound came, just a breath like a hiss of pain. He lifted her ankle carefully, felt the heat of fever radiating through the bandage. She flinched, twisting her shoulder away, but he held her steady. The water burned against raw flesh. Her jaw clenched, eyes squeezing shut as he wiped blood from the swollen joint. The room was silent, except for the scrape of cloth and the pop of the stove. Ethan worked fast, wrapping the linen tight, knotting it firm. When he let her leg down onto the folded blanket, she released a breath that trembled like a sob, but she did not cry. He rose without a word, set the basin aside, then ladled out stew from the iron pot. He placed the tin bowl near her, but she only stared at it. Her eyes flicked from the steam to his face, suspicion hard as stone. "It's food," he said flatly. Still, she didn't move. Her hand hovered near the rim, then pulled back. Ethan sighed, sank into the chair across the room. He'd seen that look before. Starved soldiers who thought every kindness was a trick. She would either trust the meal or starve with it inches from her. Minutes dragged. The only sound the wind through the shutters. Then, slowly, she reached again. Fingers curled around the bowl, lifting it as though it might bite. She brought it to her lips and sipped. One swallow. Then another. Hunger won. She ate in silence, eyes never leaving him. Ethan let her watch, meeting her stare only once before turning back to the fire. When the bowl was empty, she set it carefully on the stool, as if returning a weapon. Her shoulders sagged, but the tension in her gaze never eased. She shifted under the blanket, pulled it higher around her chest, and lay down without closing her eyes. Ethan leaned forward, rubbing the scar at his knee through the cloth of his trousers. Pain flared, sharp as always in the cold. He thought of the road that had led him here 3 winters of silence, the hollow ache of a brother buried far from home. And now this girl, bleeding in his cabin, eyes burning holes through him like he was one more enemy in a long line. He didn't speak again that night, neither did she. The cabin filled with firelight, with silence, with a tension that felt less like peace and more like a truce. Ethan lay down on the floorboards, rifle within reach, wool blanket pulled over his shoulders. Across the room, the woman shifted once, then stilled. 2 strangers, 2 worlds, bound by nothing yet except a wound, a fire, and the uneasy knowledge that neither trusted the other to last until morning. The storm outside pressed harder that night, wind clawing at the shutters as though it meant to rip the cabin from its foundation. Ethan sat near the fire, sharpening the edge of his old knife out of habit.
Across the room, the woman watched him from the cot, her body taut beneath the blanket, her ankle propped on folded cloth. She had not spoken a word since admitting she understood English. Silence might have been safer, but it weighed heavier than the storm. Ethan broke it first.
"What do I call you?" he asked, eyes on the blade. Her stare lingered on him, sharp, calculating. Then, at last, she answered, her voice low, hoarse but steady. "Naya." The name settled between them, fragile but real. Ethan nodded once, slipping the knife back into its sheath. Minutes passed before she spoke again. "They said I was cursed." Ethan looked up. She hadn't moved, but her gaze burned with a bitterness deeper than fear. "My mother died when I was young," she said, "the year the rains never came. Then my sister was taken by fever. They said it followed me, that I carried death. When the crops failed, they blamed me again." Her jaw tightened. "So they cast me out." Her voice broke, not with tears, but with rage too dry to weep. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the fire throwing lines across his scarred face. "That why you were running?" She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes flicked to the door, then back to him, as though daring him to say what she feared that he agreed with them. But Ethan only shook his head. "I've seen curses," he muttered. "Lead balls tearing through men, boys buried where no one remembers their names."
"You don't look like one of those." For the first time, her eyes softened, not much, just enough to loosen the edge. He drew a long breath, his own words scraping something raw inside him. "My brother was 17. Should have been home in Georgia, but he followed me into the war. Thought if we fought side by side, I could keep him safe." He paused, staring into the flames. The sound of the wind filled the silence for him. "I was wrong," he said at last. The fire popped, sparks leaping into the dark chimney. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He didn't have to. For a long while, neither said more. The storm battered the ridge, shaking the walls, but inside the cabin there was a different kind of storm, 2 lives scarred by exile, both carrying wounds no bandage could bind. Naya pulled the blanket higher, her body curling into itself. Yet her eyes lingered on Ethan, not with suspicion this time, but with the quiet recognition of someone who knew what it meant to be left behind. He met her gaze once, and for the first time since finding her in the snare, the look she gave him wasn't fear, it was understanding. Morning light slipped pale through the shutters, streaking across the cabin walls. The storm had eased, leaving only a brittle cold that pressed through every crack in the timbers. Ethan set another log on the fire, the flames licking higher. Behind him, Naya sat propped against the wall, her blanket wrapped tight, her torn deerskin dress visible beneath. The fabric hung loose and frayed, the seams split across the shoulder, edges stiff with dried blood. Ethan glanced once, then turned away quickly. Modesty was not something the wilderness gave easily, but respect was something he refused to abandon. He opened the trunk at the foot of his bedroll and rummaged through the folded clothes. Most were worn thin, patched with rough stitches, but one shirt, a coarse cotton, faded from years, was still sound. He carried it over and set it on the stool beside her. "Here," he said. She stared at it, not touching. Her eyes flicked from the shirt to his face, searching for the catch. "It's clean," he added, "warm enough, better than that." His nod went to the torn hide across her shoulders. For a moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the fabric, testing it like it might vanish. She held it close, running her thumb over the seam, as though the cloth itself carried some secret. Ethan stepped back, giving her space. He turned to the fire again, poking at the coals, pretending not to notice as she shifted under the blanket, tugging the shirt over her frame. When he looked back, the sleeves hung long past her wrists, the shoulders sagging. It wasn't pretty, but it was safe. Naya's eyes met his then, steady, unreadable. She didn't thank him, she didn't need to. The way she held the fabric spoke enough.
Ethan lowered himself into the chair, rubbing at his knee as the ache throbbed with the cold. His mother's voice drifted back, a fragment from long ago, words she'd spoken when she mended his clothes as a boy. Above all, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony, Colossians 3:14. He had never thought much of it before, but now, watching Naya clutch the old shirt like armor, the verse seemed less like scripture on a page and more like something alive. The silence between them had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the ground beneath suspicion had cracked. Naya tugged the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze lowering to the fire. For the first time since she had been carried into the cabin, her body seemed to rest, not fully, but enough that her breathing slowed, her jaw no longer locked against every movement he made. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of his own breath easing. The cabin still felt like a cage, but no longer one holding enemies. It held survivors. And for the first time, it felt like the silence might break. The days stretched long in the cabin, marked only by the rhythm of firewood, stew, and silence. Snow pressed heavy on the roof, creaking under its weight. Ethan moved with his usual efficiency, hauling wood, checking traps, mending tools, but every so often his eyes drifted to the cot where Naya sat, her ankle wrapped, her dark hair tangled across her shoulders. By the third morning, she spoke first. "I can work." Ethan turned from the stove, brow furrowing. "On that leg? You'll tear it open." "I can sit, chop kindling, wash dishes, something." Her voice was flat, but beneath it was an edge of pride that refused pity. He hesitated, then pulled the stool closer to the hearth, laid a small axe on the woodpile beside it. "Don't push it." Naya gripped the handle, tested its weight. Her first few strikes were clumsy, the blade glancing off knots, but her arms were strong, her grip steady. She worked in silence, lips pressed thin. Ethan didn't correct her, didn't step in. He simply watched, letting her find her rhythm. When the pieces of wood began to split clean, she glanced up at him briefly. And in that glance he caught something new, relief, maybe even a flicker of satisfaction. Later, as she swept dust into the corner with a rag-wrapped broom, she spoke again. "What's your name?" He had avoided it until now, not out of secrecy, but because names carried weight. Still, her eyes held his, waiting. "Ethan," he said at last, "Ethan Walker." She nodded once, then bent back to her task, as though the name had settled something. That night, when he sat by the fire sharpening his knife, she leaned against the wall, her leg propped on a folded blanket. The cotton shirt he had given her hung loose, sleeves rolled at the wrists. For the first time, she looked less like a fugitive and more like someone who belonged to the room. Ethan caught himself watching her longer than he meant to. The firelight softened the sharpness of her face, smoothed the lines of suspicion. He shifted his gaze quickly back to the blade, focusing on the scrape of steel against stone. She noticed. Her lips pressed, not with fear this time, but with something unreadable. "You don't stare," she said suddenly. The knife paused in his hand. "Should I?" "Most men do." He set the blade down slowly, his voice even. "I'm not most men." Silence settled again, but different than before. Not the silence of strangers, but of people measuring each other with new eyes. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his scarred knee. Naya watched the flames, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. 2 names had been spoken. 2 lives, scarred but still breathing, now orbiting the same fire. The room no longer felt like 2 worlds colliding. It felt, just faintly, like a place where both might stay. The knock came just past midday. 3 sharp raps against the door, cutting through the hush of the pines. Ethan's hand froze on the handle of his knife. Across the room, Naya stiffened, her eyes wide, body rigid as if the sound itself were a trap. Ethan rose slowly, motioning her toward the cot. "Stay quiet." He crossed the cabin, rifle within easy reach, and cracked the door. A man stood outside, his coat dusted white with snow, a tin star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Thomas Reed. He wasn't young, graying beard, lines cut deep into his face, but his eyes were steady, the kind that missed little. His horse snorted behind him, stamping against the cold. "Walker," the sheriff said, "heard you're still holed up out here." "That I am." "Mind if I come in?" Ethan stepped aside just enough to let him through. The sheriff's boots thudded against the boards, his gaze sweeping the room in one slow arc. He saw the stove, the 2 tin plates drying by the basin, the blanket folded by the hearth. His eyes lingered a beat too long before turning back to Ethan. "Winter's been hard," Reed said casually. "Town's been restless, rumors going round." Ethan crossed his arms. "Rumors about what?" "About a woman, Apache. Said she slipped a convoy couple weeks back. Dangerous, they say."
"Folks claim she was spotted near these ridges." His tone was calm, but his eyes cut sharp. "You seen anything?" Behind him, Naya gripped the blanket tighter, her breath caught. Ethan didn't glance her way, didn't give her away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to feel heavy, then answered, "No one here but me." The sheriff studied him, jaw working under his beard. "Coyotes leave tracks like moccasins these days?" Ethan's voice was flat. "If you're here to measure prints, snow's the wrong place." For a long moment, only the crackle of the fire filled the room. Reed's gaze slid once more across the walls, over the cot where the blanket bunched high. But he didn't press. At last he nodded. "You've always kept to yourself, Walker. I'd keep it that way. There's bounty men riding through, hungry ones. Not law, not patient. If they think you're harboring someone, you'll find trouble you don't want." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Noted." The sheriff tipped his hat, turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he glanced back once more, eyes narrowing on the shadows by the fire. Naya held her breath until the door shut, the crunch of boots faded into the snow, and the sound of a horse carried down the ridge. Only then did she exhale, sharp and trembling. Her hands shook against the blanket, but her eyes locked on Ethan. "You lied," she whispered. Ethan leaned the rifle against the wall, his face unreadable. "I told him what he needed to hear." Her chest rose fast, emotions caught between fear and something harder to name. "You risked yourself." Ethan met her gaze evenly. "Wasn't a choice." For the first time, she believed him. Night closed heavy over the ridge. The fire burned low, casting long shadows against the log walls. Ethan sat in his chair, rubbing the scar along his wrist, the same habit that came whenever silence grew too long. Across from him, Naya lay against the cot, her head propped on a folded blanket, her dark hair spilling loose across her shoulders. She had eaten well more than the first nights, and the color had begun to return to her face. But the weight in her eyes remained, the kind that came from years of watching shadows move closer. For a while, neither spoke. The crackle of the fire filled the cabin, the wind pressed at the shutters, and the quiet seemed almost comfortable. Almost. Naya broke it first. Her voice was soft, steady. "You could have given me up today." Ethan didn't look up. Wasn't a choice. She studied him from across the room. For most men, it would be. His jaw flexed. He set the tin cup aside, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "Most men aren't me." Her eyes lingered on him, searching for cracks, for the lie she half expected. She didn't find one. "I've only known pain from men," she said finally, her tone flat as stone. "Bought, traded, treated like a burden, like a curse." The fire popped, sparks scattering up the chimney. Ethan's hand tightened against his knee. "You won't know that from me." Silence stretched. Naya's gaze flicked down, then up again, meeting his with something unguarded for the first time. "That's why I haven't run." He blinked, the words settling deeper than he expected. The room grew still, heavy with the kind of quiet that didn't push them apart, but pulled them closer. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the flames, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You don't have to fear me." Her breath trembled, but not with fear. She rolled onto her side, her cheek resting against her arm, eyes never leaving him. Then, with a steadiness that made the fire seem suddenly small, she said, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The words hung in the air, warm as the fire, sharp as a blade cutting through years of silence. Ethan swallowed hard, the ache in his chest different from the old wound in his knee. This was new, something he hadn't felt since before the war, before the graves and the exile. He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her across the fire said enough. Naya's eyes softened, her lips pressing into the faintest trace of something close to peace. For the first time since he found her bleeding in the snow, the cabin no longer felt like a prison for two lost souls. It felt like the beginning of something that might outlast the storm. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The knock rattled the cabin door, 3 sharp strikes that cut through the quiet like an axe splitting wood. Ethan froze where he stood, one hand still on the rifle propped against the hearth. Across the room, Naya stiffened, her dark eyes wide, her whole body shrinking into the shadows. Another knock, slower this time, deliberate. Ethan crossed the floor and slid the bolt back just far enough to crack the door. The man outside looked out of place on the ridge. His boots were too clean, his long black coat free of snow, a polished revolver hanging easy on his hip. He was tall, lean, with a mustache trimmed sharp and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You Walker?" the man asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I am," Ethan said evenly. The stranger tilted his head, studying him. "Name's Caleb Hanlon. Heard talk you might be shelterin' something that belongs to me." Ethan didn't move. "I don't keep company." Hanlon's smile twitched. "Not what I heard. Word in Valero says footprints, small ones, not yours, moccasins." His gaze flicked past Ethan's shoulder into the dim cabin, eyes quick and hungry. "I'm looking for an Apache girl, young, dark hair, strong. Escaped government custody a few weeks back. She's marked as property. Mine to return." The words slid like poison into the cold air. Behind Ethan, he could feel Naya's breath catch, sharp as glass. Ethan shifted, filling the doorway with his frame. "No one here but me. You've been lied to." Hanlon chuckled low, leaning on one boot heel. "See, I don't much like being lied to. Girl like that fetches a good price. Worth my trouble, worth my ride. Now, you let me look around, or I might think you're the one doing the lying." Ethan's jaw tightened. His hand rested near the butt of his rifle, though he hadn't raised it yet. "This is my land, bought and paid. You're not law. You don't come inside." The bounty hunter's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, the false charm peeling away to reveal something colder beneath. He shifted his weight, gloved hand brushing the edge of his revolver. "Careful now, Walker," he said softly. "You put yourself between me and what's mine, you're standing on the wrong side of a bullet." The air between them hung heavy, the ridge behind silent, the snow falling in slow, soundless sheets. Ethan didn't blink. "Then that's where I'll stand." For a moment, neither moved. The crack of the door became the edge of a battlefield, one breath away from violence. And inside, Naya's heart pounded loud enough she thought the stranger might hear it through the walls. There would be no turning back now. The standoff at the doorway hung in silence. Snow drifted in lazy spirals beyond Caleb Hanlon's shoulder. But the stillness inside the cabin was sharper, like glass about to break. Then a voice rang out from behind Ethan. "You're lying!" Hanlon's head jerked, eyes narrowing past Ethan into the cabin. Naya had risen from the cot, one hand braced on the wall, the other clutching the blanket tight around her shoulders. Her ankle trembled beneath her weight, but her gaze was fixed and burning. "You never guarded me," she said, her voice rough but steady. "You tried to sell me."
Hanlon's mouth twisted into a grin. "Well, look at that, she talks." His eyes gleamed, mocking. "And you remember. I did offer you a trade. Fair price. Good money. Just business, girl. That don't make me a liar." "You chained me," she spat, her words trembling with fury. "You left me without food, waiting to be bought like cattle. That's not business. That's slavery." The smile vanished. Hanlon's jaw tightened, and his hand brushed closer to the revolver at his hip. "Careful now. You speak too loud. You might forget who's still holding the gun." Ethan moved then, slow but deliberate, stepping fully into the doorway, his broad frame blocking Hanlon's view of her. His voice was low, flat as hammered iron. "She's not yours." Hanlon's gaze flicked up, icy and sharp. "Then she's yours?" "No," Ethan said, his hand steady on the stock of his rifle. "She's her own. But if you want her, you'll have to take me first." The cabin seemed to shrink in on itself, firelight flickering against the walls, the air dense with the weight of the choice Ethan had just made. Inside, Naya's chest heaved, her fingers tightening around the blanket until the fabric dug into her palms. She looked at Ethan's back, the scarred shoulders, the set of his jaw, and something broke open inside her, something she hadn't dared hope. The words of scripture her grandmother once whispered came back to her, now spoken in Ethan's stance, as if written across the silence. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He had become the verse. Her fear trembled, then fell away, replaced by a raw, dangerous hope. Hanlon chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You really mean to die for her, Walker? For some cursed squaw the world already threw away?" Ethan's eyes didn't flinch. "I've buried too many I loved. I won't bury her, too." For the first time, Caleb Hanlon's smile cracked, revealing the anger simmering beneath. His hand slid, slow and certain, toward the grip of his revolver. The cabin was one heartbeat from erupting. And Nayan knew Ethan had made his choice, and so had she. Caleb Hanlon's hand slid lower, the leather of his holster creaking in the silence. His eyes never left Ethan's, cold and certain. The world outside the doorway seemed to vanish. Only the two men remained, bound by the breath between action and death. Naya gripped the blanket tighter, her throat dry, her body frozen as though the wrong sound would spark the gun. Hanlon's smile returned, thin and venomous. "Last chance, Walker. Step aside. Live to trap your rabbits another day." Ethan's reply was steady, carved from stone. "Not today." Hanlon moved.
The revolver cleared its holster in a blur of polished steel, but Ethan's rifle was already leveled. The shot cracked like thunder, shattering the cabin's stillness. Smoke burst from the muzzle, the recoil jarring through Ethan's shoulder. Outside, Caleb Hanlon staggered backward, his revolver clattering uselessly into the snow. He gasped once, eyes wide with shock, the grin gone forever. Then his body toppled, hitting the frozen ground with a hollow thud. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The echo of the rifle shot rolled off the ridge, fading into the pines. Snowflakes drifted down, soft and soundless, settling over the still figure sprawled in the white. Inside, Ethan lowered the rifle, his chest heaving with the weight of what had just passed. His fingers still trembled against the trigger guard, the smell of powder sharp in the air. Behind him, Naya's knees buckled. She sank to the cot, her breath breaking out in ragged bursts. Not fear, relief, disbelief, something too raw to name. Ethan stepped outside slowly, his boots crunching in the frost. The bounty hunter's eyes stared blankly at the sky, snow already dusting his black coat.
Ethan crouched, pressing 2 fingers to the man's throat, though he knew the truth before he touched. No pulse. He rose, silent, staring down at the body. For years he had carried death in memory, brothers, soldiers, strangers lost to war. But this was different. This one he had chosen, not the army, not orders. This death was his line drawn. Snow kept falling, covering Caleb Handlon inch by inch, as if the land itself wanted to bury him. Ethan turned back toward the cabin. Naya was there in the doorway, her blanket still wrapped around her, her dark hair wild from the trembling. Their eyes met. For the first time since he'd found her in the snare, she looked at him without fear. And for the first time in years, Ethan looked at death without regret. The cabin was quiet again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the hush of strangers or the calm before violence. It was the silence of survival. Together. The grave was shallow, hacked into the frozen ridge with Ethan's old spade. The ground was hard, the earth brittle with frost, but he worked until sweat mingled with the cold air. Naya stood nearby, wrapped in her blanket, her breath fogging before her lips.
She said nothing, only watched as each strike of the spade rang hollow against stone. At last, the hole was deep enough. Ethan dragged Caleb Handlon's body to the edge, boots scraping against the snow, the black coat already stiff with ice. He rolled him in without ceremony. The thud of the body against frozen soil echoed sharp in the still woods. For a moment, Ethan stood over the pit, staring down at the face already fading beneath a dust of snow. Caleb's eyes were open, but empty. A man who had lived for greed, gone silent in a land that had no memory for men like him. Ethan took up the spade again and began to cover him. Each shovel of dirt landed with a dull slap, scattering across the black coat. Naya's hands trembled against her blanket, but she did not look away. She let herself watch the earth reclaim the man who had hunted her, tried to chain her, tried to strip her of what little freedom she had. When the grave was filled, Ethan stood with the spade planted in the earth, his breath rising in clouds. The silence around them was deep, broken only by the whisper of wind in the pines. Naya stepped forward. Her bare feet pressed into the snow, but she did not flinch. She stood beside him, eyes on the fresh mound. Then, slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. "You chose me," she said softly. Ethan turned his head, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with exhaustion, but there was something else now, something fierce and alive. "You were never theirs to take," he answered. Her breath caught, and for a moment she only stared at him, as if testing whether the words would hold. Then she stepped closer, leaning into his side, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't fear, it was trust. Ethan dropped the spade, letting it fall into the snow. His arms slipped around her shoulders, pulling her against him. They stood like that before the grave, two figures bound not by chains, but by a choice made in blood and fire. The wind rose, carrying flakes of snow across the mound, erasing the shape of it little by little. Soon, no one would know Caleb Handlon had ever been there. But both of them would remember the moment the world tried to take, and Ethan said no. And Naya, for the first time, knew what it meant to be chosen. Night returned heavy, the kind that swallowed sound. The fire in the stove burned low, shadows stretching across the log walls. Ethan rolled out his blanket on the floor, as he had every night since bringing Naya to the cabin. His body ached with the labor of the day, with the weight of what they had done. Across the room, Naya sat on the edge of the cot, her hair loose, the cotton shirt he had given her hanging loose at her frame. She hadn't spoken since the burial. The silence was not cold, but full, like words too large to be said. Ethan settled onto the boards, his rifle within reach, his breath slow. He thought she might sleep. Instead, her voice came soft through the firelight. "I don't want to be alone tonight." He turned his head. She stood barefoot on the planks, the blanket trailing behind her like a shadow. She didn't tremble. She didn't look hunted. Her eyes were steady, her steps quiet as she crossed the room. Ethan sat up, his hands braced on his knees. "Naya!" She shook her head before he could speak. "I'm not asking out of fear, not for warmth, for me." Her words cut through the years of exile in both their lives. He hesitated, then shifted aside, pulling the wool blanket back. She lowered herself beside him, her body curling carefully against his. Her hand rested light on his chest, her cheek settling near his shoulder. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the hard lines of bruises nearly healed. Ethan lay still, hardly daring to breathe. He had shared foxholes, tents, and barracks with men who snored and cursed the night away. But never this, never the quiet weight of someone choosing to be close, not out of survival, but choice. He turned his head slightly, enough to whisper, "You don't owe me anything." His voice came back steady. "I know." The words were small, but they carried more than thanks, more than surrender. They carried freedom. He let his hand rest lightly against her shoulder, not pulling, only being. She shifted closer, her leg brushing his, her breath warm against the fabric of his shirt. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the ache of loneliness ease, not with noise or distraction, but with simple presence. No urgency, no demand, just two souls no longer separated by fear.
The cabin was quiet except for the soft crack of firewood and the rhythm of their breathing, rising and falling together. Outside, the snow pressed silent against the ridge. Inside, for the first time, neither of them felt hunted. They felt found. Spring came slowly to the ridge. The snow thinned first on the southern slopes, patches of dark soil showing through like wounds healing. The creek behind the cabin swelled with meltwater, its voice louder than it had been in months. Pines shed their white burden, needles shining wet beneath the pale sun. Inside, the air was different too. The cabin no longer smelled only of smoke and iron stew, but of fresh-cut wood and soap. Naya moved with quiet purpose, sweeping dust, boiling water, hanging herbs to dry along the rafters. The limp in her step had faded. The scar at her ankle remained, but it no longer bound her. Ethan watched her from the porch one morning, coffee steaming in his hand. She knelt in the thawing soil, fingers working seeds into neat rows. Beans, onions, squash. Her dark hair spilled loose over her shoulders, her face calm, intent on the earth. For a moment, Ethan let the sight settle deep into him. A woman once hunted, now planting life into ground that was finally ready to receive it. He made 2 trips into Valero that month. The first, men stared longer than usual, whispers trailing in his wake. He caught the word Apache once, muttered sharp like a knife. But no one spoke it to his face. He bought his flour, his beans, his coffee, and rode home. The second trip, the sheriff himself crossed his path. Reed's eyes were steady, his nod short, his words plain. "Keep to yourself, Walker, that's enough." Then he walked on, and nothing more was said. Rumors would linger, Ethan knew, but they were just that, rumors. The ridge was theirs, and no one dared climb it. Back at the cabin, Naya met him at the door. No fear in her eyes, only the calm of someone who no longer lived hunted. That evening, they sat together by the fire. She stitched a tear in his old coat while he mended a trap. Silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was the silence of people who no longer needed to explain themselves. When she finished the last stitch, she set the coat aside and looked at him. Her eyes held the flicker of firelight, warm and unguarded.
"I used to think I'd never belong anywhere," she said softly. "You do now," Ethan answered. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Not in disbelief, not in hesitation, in acceptance. Outside, the snow melted into the soil. Inside, 2 lives once broken found their ground. Naya no longer felt cursed, no longer felt hunted. She felt chosen. And Ethan Walker, after years of exile and silence, finally knew he had chosen too. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. By March, the ridge had shed its winter skin. Snow clung only in shaded hollows, and even there it thinned each day beneath the sun. The creek roared louder, carrying ice downstream to places where spring had come sooner. Birds returned, flitting through branches that only weeks ago stood black and bare. Ethan worked with steady hands, setting posts into thawed earth for a new frame beside the cabin. His palms blistered against the haft of the mallet, but he welcomed the ache. It was the kind of pain that built rather than destroyed, unlike the war's old wound that still nagged at his knee.
Naya sat on the porch steps, wrapped in one of his coats, her hair braided loosely over her shoulder. She watched him work, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Her face carried a stillness Ethan had not seen before, not the guarded silence of a fugitive, nor the brittle quiet of someone waiting to be abandoned, but a peace born of staying. When he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, she rose and came to his side. Her steps were slow, careful, though her limp had nearly vanished. She laid a hand against the rough timber, then looked at him with something both simple and vast. "You're building a room," she said softly. "For us," he answered. He hesitated, then added, "For the child, too." Her eyes flickered, but not with surprise. She had told him only a week before, her voice calm, without trembling. "I think it started," she'd said, one hand resting against her belly. The words had dropped into him like stones into still water, spreading rings that had not stopped moving since. Now she touched his arm, steady and warm. "It's good," she said. "This will be good." Ethan drove the next post deeper, the mallet striking wood with a sound that carried into the trees. With every beam lifted, every nail driven, he felt the cabin transform. No longer a place to hide from the world, but a place that dared to face it. At night, when the hammering ceased and the ridge fell quiet, they sat together on the porch steps. Naya wrapped her shawl close, the air still sharp with cold, while Ethan held a tin cup between his hands. The stars stretched endless overhead, the sky clear, the ridge lit by a pale silver glow. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long time they said nothing. At last she whispered, "When I was cast out, I thought I'd carry that curse forever, thought I'd die with it." Ethan turned, his voice low but firm. "You were never cursed." Her lips pressed, as if holding back words. Then she released them, small but certain. "I believe that now." He reached across, laying his rough hand over hers. Her fingers curled around his, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, carrying everything they had lost and everything they had found. The ridge still held danger, still held whispers and shadows beyond the pines. But here, between them, was something stronger. A life not stolen, not chased, but chosen. The child she carried was proof of it, proof that what the world had tried to throw away had taken root instead. Ethan squeezed her hand, then looked back at the stars. His voice was almost a prayer, though he spoke it like plain truth. "This time," he said, "we build something that lasts." And Naya, with her head against his shoulder and her hand against her belly, answered not with words, but with a quiet breath that carried all the hope of spring. By the end of April, the cabin had changed. What had once been a one-room shelter, walls darkened by years of smoke, floorboards groaning under loneliness, now carried the sound of new life. The second room stood solid beside the first, its walls tight, the timber fresh and pale against the older logs. Ethan had cut every beam himself, hands blistered and raw, but he carried no complaint. This was labor he chose. Naya filled the room slowly. A trunk at the foot of the wall. A folded blanket, stitched with her own hands. A cradle, rough but sturdy, that Ethan carved in the evenings when the fire burned low. She moved through the space with quiet reverence, as though every nail and seam had meaning. And it did. This was no longer just a cabin on a ridge. It was theirs. One morning, Ethan stood at the porch with a plank of wood in his hands. He had carved it the night before, his knife steady, his strokes slow and sure. The name was cut deep, plain and unornamented, but true. Walker. Naya stepped beside him, her hands folded at her belly, now gently round beneath the folds of her dress. She looked at the sign, then at him.
No question passed her lips. She simply nodded, as if the name had already been hers long before the carving. Ethan lifted the board, nailed it above the cabin door. The sound of the hammer rang clear against the trees, echoing down the ridge. When he finished, he stepped back, the sunlight catching on the fresh letters. For the first time in years, he felt his brother's shadow ease, as if the name finally belonged not to grief, but to something alive. Naya slipped her hand into his. Her eyes softened, shimmering in the morning light. She whispered a verse, one her mother had once told her beneath starlight long ago. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Jeremiah 29:11. The words lingered in the air, not as a sermon, but as truth. Ethan's hand tightened around hers. For years he had thought the future was something already buried, carved into the soil along with the dead. Now, standing with her beneath the sign, he believed otherwise. Days passed into weeks. The garden rose sprouted green, the earth yielding to Naya's careful hands. The creek sang louder, swollen with spring. The cabin walls no longer held silence, but the murmur of shared words, the sound of laughter soft and rare, the rustle of two lives woven together. At night, Ethan still laid his rifle by the door, old habits lingering. But when he turned toward the fire, he saw her there, wrapped in his shirt, hair braided long, her hand resting over the life inside her. And the old fear, the emptiness that had haunted him through winters past, lost its hold. Sometimes she spoke in her native tongue, words he did not always understand.
But he listened, and in listening he learned more than translation. He learned her cadence, her quiet strength, the music of a life not cursed but enduring. On the last evening of spring they sat together on the porch. The sky stretched wide and endless, the horizon glowing gold. Ethan's arm wrapped around her shoulders, her head resting against him. The land below was vast and untamed, but for once it did not feel hostile. It felt like home. They had begun in fear, two broken souls bound by chance and snow. They had endured fire, gunfire, and silence. Now they ended with something rarer than survival. They ended with love, and the kind of peace that stays. As the fire fades on this chapter, perhaps you, too, feel the weight of winters past, the quiet of an empty house, the ache of loved ones gone, the long nights where silence is your only companion. Ethan and Naya's story is more than fiction. It is a reflection of the longing we all carry, for love that chooses us, for peace that endures after hardship. Maybe you remember a time when kindness came unexpected, or when faith pulled you through the darkest valley.
Those memories remind us that even in the harshest wilderness, God plants seeds of hope. If this tale touched your heart, let it be a lantern on your own ridge. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not forgotten. And if you'd like more true Wild West stories, stories of grit, grace, and the quiet triumph of the human spirit, be sure to like, subscribe, and join us again by the fire.